In this video, we're going to talk about two more ways of classifying crime or different behaviors in the criminology studies. For example, we'll talk about felony versus misdemeanor, and we'll talk about mala in se versus mala prohibita. Now, felony versus misdemeanor is really two levels of criminal behavior. A felony tends to be something that's a serious enough crime that is punishable by either the death penalty or prison. And prison, to be sent there, it's typically going to be a requirement of you serving a year of time. So typically, you have to be serving an entire year to get a prison sentence rather than a jail sentence. And misdemeanors tend to go to jail or have some sort of fine or some sort of forfeiture of something. So, felony and misdemeanor, in the big scheme of things, is really a difference of the seriousness, and it's a difference of the punishments available for that type of crime. Now, to give you an example, I've taken homicide, and we're going to break it down into different levels, different degrees, because crimes are broken down by degree. Different levels are established. So there's different levels of felonies, there's different levels of misdemeanors, there are different levels of forfeitures. For example, in felony crimes, the max penalty tends to be death penalty or life in prison, and then there are different levels below that have different levels of time that you're required to be in prison, for example. And, like a first degree crime tends to be something that gets a harsher punishment than a second degree crime. And let's look at some key examples here. First example is first degree homicide, first degree murder. And we're gonna go through different levels of murder so you can kind of see how they're differentiated and see how the penalties could be different. So first degree murder is something that's premeditated. So it's planned ahead of time. It's deliberate. So someone didn't accidentally murder someone. Deliberate means they planned it ahead of time and they did it on purpose. For example, we could always look at the Aurora, Colorado shooting in which a man went to a Batman movie with a gun and he shot up the movie theater. He had planned this ahead and he did it on purpose. And you can see him featured on the screen. And that's going to receive a harsher penalty. There's going to be availability of life in prison or the death penalty, depending on the state. So something that's planned ahead and deliberate is going to definitely fall into that first degree homicide realm. Now, the edges of first degree and second degree are often very blurred because what is premeditated or what is deliberate, that can be hard to say. So if you're a prosecutor, though, you're trying to prove that they planned it ahead and that they did it on purpose with whatever evidence you have. I'll give you another example. If you look at people that were captured for terrorism around September 11th, you have people that they found evidence that it was premeditated and it was deliberate, that it was planned ahead. So a lot of those bigger terrorist attacks, you can find clear evidence that they planned it, that they had diagrams, that they gathered things to plan ahead for this type of attack. Now, second degree murder or second degree homicide typically has, it's maybe not premeditated, maybe it's not planned, and maybe it's not intentional. You're acting without regard for your actions. So, for example, let's say two people get in a fight, and the fight was they're fighting on purpose, but someone hits someone the wrong way, and the person dies. Is that a premeditated murder? Did they go into that fight planning to kill the other person? I hope you're responding no, because they probably went into it to fight the other person, maybe to knock them out or cause some sort of damage. But in the end, if you get into a fight, get into that situation, and you hit someone and they die, it could still be considered homicide because you intentionally got into that situation. It's just maybe not viewed as first degree homicide. You can see there's a clear difference. Someone that planned ahead to kill someone is very different from killing them in the midst of a fight or something like that. So it's certainly intentional that they meant to hurt them, but not planned is kind of the key here. Now, manslaughter is when you start getting into lower levels of murder or homicide. Someone died, but there really wasn't a desire to do something bad. For example, if there's like a vehicular manslaughter, someone got hit by a car, Was that person that was driving the car planning to hit someone? Probably not. So there was no desire to do anything evil. Certainly, accidents happen, but you can still be charged with a crime potentially. And there's really two different types of manslaughter as well, with different levels of penalties. There's voluntary manslaughter, and that's where you have things like crimes of passion or when someone's attacked. Voluntary manslaughter is you didn't plan anything ahead. You did not plan to do anything evil, but you were kind of caught up in the moment. For example, let's say someone breaks into your house. So you grab a gun to protect yourself and you shoot the other person. If you kill that other person, you could still be charged with a crime, depending on the state. So you could be charged with voluntary manslaughter. You killed the person. It's manslaughter because you did not intend to do anything evil, and it's not like first or second degree homicide because it wasn't premeditated, it wasn't a plan, it wasn't necessarily intentional. You probably would have done anything in your power to try and avoid, killing another person, but you ended up having to do so to protect yourself. It also falls into things like crimes of passion. You'll often hear about cases where someone walked in on their spouse cheating on them, and they lost it, and they got caught up in the anger, and they killed someone, killed maybe the person they were cheating with, or killed their spouse. Crimes of passion fall into this category, and crimes of passion are not something that is typically protected by the state, like maybe self-defense, and someone could definitely be charged with time in prison, but it's seen as a different level from that first degree homicide and that second degree homicide. It's seen as something very different, that they never planned or hoped to do anything bad. They never organized anything like that. They never premeditated anything. There's a clear difference. And they're probably going to receive a less um, harsh penalty from that. And the last type of manslaughter is involuntary manslaughter, where you really had no intent to kill, you really had no like anger involved, but you're still responsible for it. And this is where you get things like the Staten Island ferry accident and Richard Smith. And what happened is Richard Smith was a ferry driver for the Staten Island ferry, and he fell asleep at the wheel. And what ended up happening is the ferry crashed. It crashed into the coast in New York, and many people died because of that crash. People drowned. People got hurt. And Richard Smith, basically, when it happened, didn't do anything to try and rectify things. Caught in kind of a state of shock that he you know, didn't do anything to necessarily save a bunch of people. So he didn't intend to kill anybody. He wasn't caught up in a fit of passion or anger or self defense, and he's held responsible. It's his fault that those people died because he was not taking the proper care of his job. And so he faced, many, many years in prison because you can be held responsible for all of those deaths. And if there's many deaths and you're charged for each of them and you receive a penalty of like 3 or 4 years each, that could be a really long time. It could be more than just killing one person for that matter. So involuntary manslaughter is still very serious, um, but it's seen as lesser than those other types of homicide. Now, misdemeanor itself is, not a felony. It's everything else. It's punishable by a fine or confinement up to a year. And they have degrees as well. So different levels of time, different levels of, money that you can have to pay for a forfeiture. And stuff that falls into this category, stuff like traffic violations, disorderly conduct. In Wisconsin, the first DUI is considered a misdemeanor and not a felony. It's one of those um, strange exceptions that's different in Wisconsin versus most other states. So those are some examples of misdemeanors. Now, our last topic of classification is mala in se versus mala prohibita. Now, these are both Latin phrases, and they both have the word mala in them, which is all about bad or evil. And mala in se is what's called evil in itself. And it's something that's considered evil by humanity. It's something that's considered bad, even if there wasn't a law about it. So stuff like homicide and sexual assault and theft is considered basically a crime everywhere on the planet. So it's seen by humanity as something that's bad. And mala and se would kind of fit into that category. Those crimes are mala and se. Mala prohibita is more like man-made evils, things that we've prohibited just to make like things safer or because we want them to exist. So humans have been kind of creating guidelines and laws and prohibiting things all throughout their history. Think of the prohibition for that matter. When the United States banned alcohol, is alcohol necessarily evil in itself? Probably not. And many countries didn't have it as illegal at the time when we had it illegal. So we would definitely throw that into the mala prohibita category. These are these human-made crimes. Think of speed limits. It's only a crime because we made it a crime, because we're concerned about safety or concerned about vehicles. And they could fluctuate by the culture. I think of things like gambling. Some states allow gambling, some states do not. Think of prostitution. Prostitution is legal in some places in the United States and illegal in some places in the United States. So we'd probably say that that falls into the man-made, human-made crimes, where some stuff is acceptable in other places and some stuff is not. Whereas mala and se is stuff that is considered wrong no matter what. It's considered wrong by humanity, by our culture overall. So this is the one that can be tough to kind of determine. There isn't like a hard difference between mala and se and mala prohibita. A lot of it's up to interpretation. But the key example should give you some guidance on mala and se versus mala prohibita. Thank you for listening in. If you have any questions, once again, feel free to ask me in class.